nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Namo mahavaranyaya krishna prema pradayate krishnaya krishna chaitanya namne gaura tvishe namah. Jayatam surato pangor mama mandamater gati matsarvasva param bhujo radha madana mohano kuladi devatamor madana mohan jar sevak raghunatha rup sanatan jaya rupa sanatana bhatta raghunath Sri Jiva Gopala bhatta dasa raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadana Strinam Yantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambhojo Dhulisam Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved, dear associate, the foremost of the Acharyas of the Gaudiya Sampradaya, he who fulfilled his heart's desire in the world, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we will continue our reading and discussion of Padyavali, following the Rasika-rangada-tika of Sri Viracandra Prabhupada. So, today we begin a new section called Bhajana Mahatmyam, the greatness of bhajan. So in the previous section, we heard a couple of verses describing the greatness of Krishna, the object of bhajan, or the object of worship. So now we hear about the greatness of his worship. And in particular, this is the way the commentator contextualizes the content that's included in this section, or from the content in the section, we can infer what was the compiler's criterion for what he wanted to include here, was that having described how great Krishna is, then someone may feel, oh, who am I to worship him? What eligibility or what capability do I have for that? And on top of that, I can perceive in myself so many faults and reasons I would be disqualified from that. So, to preclude such concerns, or to ensure that as great as Krishna bhajan is, or as great as Krishna is, still it is open, it is possible for people, all people of the world, to worship him, then these statements about the greatness of bhajan are made. So, in other words, another way it can be put is that there's no amount of sin that can disqualify you from bhakti, nor is there any amount of worldly virtue that can qualify you for it. It's something, it is the transcendent, the spiritual, that which is not part of the dualities of the right and the wrong, or the ups and the downs within the limited sphere of embodied existence, or samsara. So in this sense, we hear now the Bhajana Mahatmyam, the greatness of worship, with a very charming verse, which is also cited by Sanatana Pad in his Hari Bhakti Vilas. It says, vyādhasyācaraṇaṁ dhruvasya cha vayo vidyā gajendrasya ka kubjāyāḥ kimu nāma rūpam adhikaṁ kim tat sudāmno dhanam vaṁśaḥ ko vidurasya yādava-pater ugrasya kim pauruṣaṁ bhaktyā tuṣyati kevalaṁ nacha guṇair bhakti-priyo mādhavaḥ. So, did the hunter have righteous conduct? Did Dhruva have age? Did Gajendra have knowledge? Did Kubjāyāḥ have bountiful beauty? Did Sudāma have wealth? Did Vidurasya have a noble lineage? Did the king of the Yadus, ugrasya, have valor? He whose pleasure is bhakti, mādhavaḥ, is satisfied only by bhakti and not by qualities. So like the verse that we discussed last time, this list of examples refers to, the histories of all of these persons, Dhruva, Gajendra, Kubjāyāḥ, Sudāma, Vidura, ugrasya, which are all described throughout the Bhagavatam and other Puranas, as well as the Mahabharata in some cases. The only exception is this vyād, or this hunter, whose name is mentioned in the Bhagavatam, but no account of his life is given, but it's mentioned elsewhere in the Puranas. So we'll get to a little bit about the details of these persons later. But the author is evidently writing this verse for persons who are steeped in Puranic lore, if we can call it that, and drawing out an essential teaching that pervades all of these narratives. So what is the central narrative in the lives of all of these persons is that they were bhaktas. And as bhaktas, they lacked certain qualities or certain things which in the worldly context are considered valuable. But despite lacking those things, they nevertheless succeeded in bhakti, or succeeded in pleasing Bhagavan, and ultimately experiencing bhakti. So, we'll dive into this a little bit. So one thing we can note is that in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, this verse is cited in a subsection called Bhagavad Toshanam, which is a subsection about Bhagavad Bhakti. So of many of Bhagavad Bhakti's qualities, one of perhaps the most important is that it is pleasing to Bhagavan, or satisfying to Bhagavan. So to illustrate that bhakti is satisfying to him, this verse is cited there. So the commentator zeroes in very sharply on the most important word in the verse, which is bhakti-priyo. This is a name of Bhagavan, or it's presented as a nominal word. So bhakti-priyo. So he gives two meanings. He whose pleasure is bhakti, or he whose pleasure is because of bhakti. You could also interpret it as he to whom bhakti is dear, or who holds bhakti dear. But in this case, the commentator takes the word priya, which can mean dear as well as pleasing, in the sense of pleasing, because in the context in the verse, the statement is specifically made that bhakti is pleasing to Bhagavan. So he cites another passage that's in the Padma Puran, which is discussed in the Sindhu, which describes bhakti as captivating of Bhagavan. So there's an inner relationship between control and pleasure, in the sense that people oftentimes conceive of themselves to freely perform an act that pleases them. But that same dynamic can be described as the person being controlled by, or motivated by, or captivated by an action which results in their experience of satisfaction. So they're actually making a dependent action, which is the dependence being the force of the feeling of want of happiness that is driving the person to then perform the action in order to fulfill that state of want. So this is said to be the fundamental, ingrained way that the mind functions within samsara, that the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of pain or suffering, these can be traced as the two fundamental drives within every action that every coherent conscious being performs. So, Jiva Gosvami, in his comment on this section in the Sindhu, he goes into this. He doesn't explain all of this, but he makes a comment which presupposes that the reader is aware of this fundamental analysis of the way the psyche functions, by saying that when Bhagavan is said to be captivated or controlled by bhakti, then does that mean that it's causing him suffering and that it forces him to follow it, because if he doesn't follow it, he'll suffer, or it's a coercion by force? Saying, no. It's not captivation like that, the way a prisoner is captivated for fear of being executed, or this sort of circumstance where one is controlled by seeking to avoid pain. Rather, it's captivated to him because it's such a cause of pleasure for him that he has never any inclination to abandon it, only inclination to keep relishing it, and therefore he voluntarily holds it dear to him, or partakes of it continuously without interruption. And so the same dynamic can be described as a, quote, free act of the pursuit, of pursuing joy, or a captivated act of pursuing joy, depending on the angle you describe it. So he's leveraging this point. And then the commentator, he makes a comparison between the relationship of a bhakta and Bhagavan with the relationship of a husband and wife. So a husband brings joy to the wife, a wife brings joy to a husband, and they both become captivated by one another, and they both captivate the other. In other words, by giving joy to the other, they, quote, captivate them, and by receiving joy from the other, they become captivated by them. So there's this mutual sharing of both roles. So similarly, Bhagavan captivates his bhaktas with all of his qualities, with all of the bliss that comes about through bhakti to him. Jiva Goswami, when he's, first establishing what is the nature of the paratattva in the Bhagavat Sandarbha, or the Advaya Gyan Tattva, then he says that the qualificand, the thing being described here, is bliss. And Brahman, Paramatma, Bhagavan, Svayam Bhagavan, etc., these are all names for, or ways of describing, particular degrees of completeness and manifestation of the existent, which is Paramananda, or the supreme bliss. So there's no doubt that those who experience this Paramananda where the greatest extent of that Ananda can be experienced, where the greatest degree of those qualities, the potentiality of his inherent potency is manifested, will inevitably experience joy, to say the least. So, in light of that, profundity of joy, there's never any inclination to pursue anything else once one has that experience. So, the bhakta effectively becomes captivated by that experience of the supreme bliss they have in relation with Bhagavan. And so too, Bhagavan also becomes captivated by his bhaktas, because there's nothing more pleasing to him than the bliss that is produced by bhakti. So in this way, both Bhagavan and his bhaktas captivate and become captivated by one another. So, then this is elucidated, or this idea that Bhagavan is pleased by and captivated by bhakti. Then to make this more vivid, then the contrast is drawn between being pleased by bhakti and being pleased by, or rather not being pleased by, non-bhakti. So there are many things in the world which in the worldly context are considered great or valuable or important, but which are not inherently bhakti, or which aren't bhakti. So qualities. So what this verse lists are all of the different assets and virtues which are considered important and useful, undoubtedly useful in the world. So to have good conduct, to have maturity of age, to have erudition, to have beauty, to have wealth, to be of noble lineage, to have valor or courage or great strength. These are all things that, get you far when it comes to worldly attainments and worldly status and so forth. But here it's saying that Bhagavan is not pleased by any of these things. So athletes please the world with their athletic ability and become rich and famous as a result. Models, actors delight the world with their beauty and skill and artistry and become rich and famous. Rich people make money because they have money and achieve fame because of their money. And in some societies still, persons of, what is considered noble birth have certain sets of privileges, enjoy certain types of prestige. Persons who have advanced knowledge have many advantages in the world. They also have certain job opportunities, etc., etc. All of these different things are significant and are ways by which others become greatly pleased. If we meet someone who's well-behaved, who's well-educated, who's beautiful, who's rich, who's courageous, who's noble, who doesn't like that person? That's the most desirable person in the world in the conventional sense. But here, what the verse is saying is you might be all of that. You might be top in all of these stats and considered the most wonderful human being. But all of that won't please Bhagavan. That won't get you anywhere in his eyes if you don't have bhakti. And even if you lack all of those things which make you so great in the world, if you have bhakti, you're good in Bhagavan's eyes or in your relationship with Bhagavan. So this is the contrast that's being highlighted in the verse. So what's perhaps least well known among the items mentioned in the verse is the first, this hunter. So the hunter is elsewhere known as the Dharma Vyād, and there's one reference to him made by Krishna himself in the 11th canto. And if we look at Jiva Goswami's Kramosandarbha on that section of the 11th canto, we find that he gives a condensed summary of the history of this hunter, or who became known as Dharma Vyād, and it's sourced from the Adi Varaha Puran. So I had to go through the Puran and found the chapters where it was from, and pardon me if this sounds ridiculous, but Jiva Goswami gave a nice summary, or having read the whole text, and then when you see how he boils it down, it's quite well done. He really, in a few words, conveys the essence of a 100+ verses. So I've given a summary here, which is slightly elaborated from what Jiva Goswami gave, giving a little bit more random detail and make it a little perhaps more interesting to read and make the ultimate point of the story slightly more clear. As we know, Jiva Goswami is, writing under length limitation, and Sanskrit writers, especially highly erudite ones, tend to be a little bit terse. So anyway, for persons who might not be familiar, I'll just share a little bit of this history. So it goes like this. There was a Brahmin living in the forest. He's like a sage doing his tapasya, etc. And he had the power to shapeshift and assume different forms. So on one occasion, he had assumed the form of a deer in the forest. But it so happened that the king of that region, who was a Vaishnava, had gone out hunting that day, saw this deer and shot the deer, thinking it's a deer, completely unaware that it's actually a sage who shapeshifted into the deer. So when this happened, then the deer died, which means the sage died. So he became what's known as a Brahma Rakshasa, which is loosely speaking like a type of ghost. And then it is said that he entered or possessed the body of this king. So then the king lived out the rest of his life, and after his life ended, then his destiny was set that he would go to Vishnu Loka. But not Vaikuntha, the Vishnu Loka beyond the realm of samsara, but the Vishnu Loka that's inside the universe, or inside the Brahmanda. So he's said to have gone there, but as he was entering there, the persons there could understand that there was this Brahma Rakshasa inside his body, so they separated the Brahma Rakshasa out without him perceiving or being aware that that took place. So then for however many, millions of years or whatever you want to, measure it, he remained in this Vishnu Loka. And eventually destiny would have it that he would now be reborn again on earth. So he was born again in a royal family and became a king, this time in Kashmir. First time it was in the south. And this Brahma Rakshasa, Brahman, had to wait, disembodied in this ghost form for all that time, which is probably not the most pleasant experience. Anyhow, when the king was finally reborn, then the Brahma Rakshasa again entered that body in a subtle manner and was dwelling inside the body of this reborn king. And eventually, the king grew and took to, various practices of bhakti and so forth. And on one occasion, he recited a special stotra, which is found in, it's given in this Purana and must have been, existent at that time that he lived, which different names are given. The actual text of the Puran calls it the Pundarikaksha Para Stava. But Jiva Gosvami, he summarizes it and calls it the Brahma Para Stava, but I don't find any mention of the word Brahma Para in the original text. So anyhow, I put both names. And when this, when the king recited this stotra, praising Bhagavan, then that recitation of Bhagavan's name and that praising of Bhagavan, that act of bhakti, created such a purifying effect that this Brahma Rakshasa was exorcised from the body of the king. And then he took the form of this very fearsome, ferocious looking tribal hunter, mountain rural hunter. So the king, and then he spoke to the king and recounted, because he still had his memory from his the past life and all this. So he told the whole story of everything that had happened since the king had killed him when he was shapeshifted into a deer. So after all of this, the king, who was a Vaishnava king and so forth, was pleased by this whole narrative and understanding of the intentions of this person. So he blessed him and said, you won't be just a hunter, you'll be dharma vyād, or the dharma hunter. You'll be a virtuous hunter, in other words. So then the hunter, this reborn sage, lived as a hunter, and he went about his life as a hunter. And he killed one animal a day, and with that he fed his family. And otherwise, he lived the life of a sage. In other words, he lived very simple in a rural, quiet place, but he lived on meat and ate meat every day. As was the occupation and the convention of his social circumstances, he just lived in that way, detached from it, and focused upon bhakti. And after some time, when his daughter had grown up, he married her, and then he went off to the tirthas, further dedicated himself to bhakti, and ultimately received darshan of Bhagavan and mukti. So it's an interesting history because it very explicitly demonstrates the idea of someone achieving Bhagavat darshan and having not been vegetarian. And of course, I'm not here to harp on vegetarianism by any means, but the idea that is cannot not coexist with bhakti is that notion is precluded by this type of history, and there are other instances of the same throughout the Shastras. So bhakti is one thing and your diet is another. Not that eating a sattvic diet is not conducive to bhakti. Definitely it is, and it's definitely important. Not trying to downplay that at all, but theologically it's also important to understand that there is a distinction between the two things. And that Bhagavan is ultimately pleased by bhakti and not your diet. And you might have a great diet, but if you're lacking in bhakti, or if you're arrogant and offensive to other bhaktas because of your diet, that can be problematic. Whereas if you're clearly focused on bhakti, even, dare I say, even fault in regard to diet could be overlooked by Bhagavan, because after all, he is pleased by bhakti and infinitely gracious. In any case, not a license to do whatever you like in the name and quoting random stories. But these points, these subtleties are worthy of appreciation. So the rest of these persons, Dhruva, Gajendra, we've heard most of these things many, many times in the Bhagavatam. I'm not going to go into those histories, and I think everyone is familiar. The only point I'll make, Dhruva didn't have age because he was only 5. Gajendra didn't have knowledge because he was an animal. He never went to school. The point I found a little bit funny was the way the commentator interpreted this point about kubjāyāḥ, because throughout the verse, there's just one word mentioning either vidyā or vayas or kevalaṁ, but when it comes to the mention of kubjāyāḥ, here the word rūpam doesn't mean form, here the word rūpa means beauty. But it doesn't just say beauty, it says adhikaṁ rūpam, or I've given it as bountiful beauty, or great beauty. So the commentator, he has to explain, why doesn't he just say beauty? That would have been enough, because generally we think Kubja was a hunchback, she wasn't beautiful, she didn't have beauty, but still Bhagavan accepted her. That would seem to suffice. But the verse says, adhikaṁ rūpam, she didn't have a lot of beauty. So the commentator explains this by saying that she did have a beautiful face, but because of her hunchback, she wasn't considered bountifully beautiful. So the implication then is that, as we hear in the Bhagavatam, when Krishna raised her up and straightened her back, then at that point, she must have been beautiful in full face and figure. Anyhow, I'd never heard any other place where this little detail about her face was ever distinguished. Perhaps that's the commentator's own idea, I don't know, but I haven't seen that in any of the 10th canto comments. Just thought it was a little bit humorous. So Sudāmno didn't have wealth, he was a detached Brahmin, lived on alms. Vidura didn't have lineage, he was born to the maidservant of who was it? Ambika and Amba? I forget. I'm not good at too much of all those Mahabharata family trees and all that, but Vedavyas with his sight caused Dhritarashtra, Pandu, and Vidura all to be born to the 2 queens and her maidservants. So Vidura was not technically part of the royal family, yet because by virtue of his great wisdom and character, he was highly honored by all the royals. And finally, Ugrasya is considered to have lacked valor because Bhima, others were known to be very valorous, but Ugrasya lost his kingdom to Kamsa and didn't show as much of that as others. So like this, we come to understand that all of these persons were lacking in these certain different respects, but nevertheless they were all bhaktas, their bhakti in its variety of forms was all accepted by Bhagavan. So I thought it was nice that the commentator then lastly he cites this fairly well-known verse of Prahlad, which highlights also the same theme that's found here in the verse we're discussing, the distinction between bhakti and all other types of virtues, assets, and so on. So I'll just read the translation. It says, O sons of the Asuras, neither being a twice-born, being a deva, or being a rishi, nor conduct, nor being greatly knowledgeable, nor charity, nor austerity, nor worship, nor cleanliness, nor rites, are able to please Mukunda. Hari, Mukunda, Bhagavan, is pleased only by taintless bhakti. All else is a sham. So this bidambana is the word in Sanskrit, which has kind of a nice ring to it. I've given here some comments of Jiva Gosvami on this verse because they're quite pertinent, and this is also a point that our Baba likes to stress on many occasions. So it says that that only bhakti is a cause of Bhagavan's love for his bhaktas, or Bhagavan's satisfaction with his bhaktas. But this bhakti must be taintless. So what is the taint? What is the difference between tainted bhakti and untainted bhakti? Then Jiva Gosvami says, amalaya means nishkamaya. That taintless bhakti means desireless bhakti. So of course bhakti always has some desire behind it. So when bhakti's only desire is the pleasure of Bhagavan, or the attainment of Bhagavan, or the bhakti itself, then that is said to be desireless, because it has no desire extraneous to itself. So nishkam bhakti, or desireless bhakti, that is free from any taint. So the implication is that the taint is doing bhakti with a desire for any object other than bhakti itself, any object other than pleasing Bhagavan, any object other than attaining Bhagavan. So, what about that tainted bhakti then? Because that state of being completely free from all such desire is exceedingly rare. So he says that if you're doing bhakti but you have these other desires, you're not really doing bhakti, you're imitating bhakti. You're acting like a bhakta does, but because your underlying motivation is different from a true bhakta, then effectively what you're doing is like a pantomime, or like an act. It's not truly bhakti. So this is the point that's made here in the commentary. So he says, the bhakti of even a sakam bhakta, being said to be mere acting, is because of it being a mere imitation of bhakti, on account of the intention within it of being a mere means to a personal object. So this is the same point that's stressed also in the definition of sadhana bhakti, where it is said that that type of bhakti which is performed for the sake of attaining bhava, or the aim of which is bhava, is called sadhana. So Jiva Gosvami there, he makes a distinction, saying when bhakti is done with a different aim, when the aim is not bhava bhakti, or the aim or the desire within the bhakti is not simply to attain or to express bhakti in its pure and ultimate form, then that's not actually sadhana bhakti. So what is it? He calls it a svarta kriya vishesh. Some particular self-centered, self-directed rite or some self-centered practice. He disqualifies it in that way. So like that, there's also a point he makes, Jiva Goswami makes here in this commentary, that bhakti also turns into, when it's not done in this taintless way, as a means to achieve one's livelihood and prestige and other worldly aims. So the fundamental purpose of bhakti is to please Bhagavan, but one uses that thing which is for pleasing Bhagavan as a means to please oneself with worldly things, to achieve whatever pursuits one has in the worldly context. So that is a misuse of what it is. So therefore it's considered tainted. So the point then is that Bhagavan is pleased by bhakti, meaning by this type of taintless bhakti, not by tainted bhakti. So Anyavilashita Shunya is specified by Rupa Goswami that uttam bhakti, or bhakti in its true and proper sense, is bhakti that has no desirousness for anything other than bhakti, anything other than pleasing Bhagavan. So this is the discussion we have for verse number 8. So just recapping a little bit, it's saying that mādhavaḥ is bhakti-priyo, is he whose pleasure is because of bhakti, or he whose pleasure is bhakti, and not by qualities. So if we reflect on this in a broader sense, we can go in different directions. On the one side, we may feel some sense of peace or relief that maybe I'm not from a noble family, I'm not a valorous person, I'm not a greatly, I don't know a whole bunch of refined etiquette, I'm not super educated, I'm not super wealthy, I don't have all of these different excellences that are found to be of value in the world, but at least I cherish this aspiration to follow this path of bhakti in some simple way, as I'm so blessed to do so to whatever extent. if we hear this verse in that respect, we can feel somewhat at peace, or some sense of simplicity and groundedness and things like this. On the other hand, we might think, well, etiquette I can kind of manage, I have a bit of knowledge, I have enough money to get by, but the thing I lack is bhakti, and that's the only thing that matters. And to have this type of pure bhakti, which is free from any other desire, this is so, profoundly difficult. And purifying the mind of all of these anarthas, all of these other impressions that have been acquired for who knows how many lifetimes, which, despite intellectual analysis and clear understanding of the futility and stupidity of fostering interest or involvement in so many things, still the conditioned mind struggles to give these things up, then one may also feel that this is a challenge or a great difficulty. It's such a task, or it feels so impossible to ever have this bhakti that will truly satisfy Bhagavan. So if we reflect in that direction, then we can also remember some statements of Jiva Gosvami, where he mentions that feelings of dainya, or a state of want, a state of lack, a state of deficiency, can also be, if we use a little bit of modern language, we can say transmuted, or can be sublimated, in the sense that something that can be a cause of unhappiness can also be used as a driving force towards what leads to something positive. So if we feel this lack, then what else is there to do but pray to Bhagavan, then chant the name of Bhagavan, then be reminded of Bhagavan, and then that, as he describes it in one place, that this dainya can then itself be, that lack of bhakti can itself become the inspiration for, again, taking to varieties of bhakti, such as prayer and prostration and so forth. So these are just a couple of additional thoughts on the subject. So I'll move on to the next verse. If anyone wants to comment or say anything about that verse, let me know. Yes? Yeah, whoever raised the hand, please go ahead. Oh, okay, now I hear. Sorry, I hear you now. Maybe you were talking already.
Yeah, it's very nice. Explanation is really good, in a sense of what is bhakti, how to obtain it, because we always, in our previous settings was that you know, to obtain bhakti, you have to give up this, give up that, give up this, give up that. So many things you have to give up, to give room to only one thing, which in logically speaking makes all sense. But as we mentioned this story about this brahmana who was in particular circumstance that he had to meet and stuff, it was conventionally acceptable. At the same time, there are many people, they may have other, I would say, circumstances or purposes in life, and they have to just continue doing them because they're born into that. As for example, some other examples. People have their purpose in life, not literally a purpose, right? Somebody's a king, somebody's a doctor, professional, somebody has some contribution to the society as artist, whatever. And so this is one thing. And then this is one part. So means that somebody may have a purpose in life that is different from bhakti, but because his bhakti is how he sees bhakti, leads him to bhava, and the other function in his life leads to necessary for the function of mind or body within the circumstance. It's different. They don't necessarily may be conflicting. If the bhakti is kept as a sacred path for one's own, in one's own life, right? So, and then we've seen destructive effects of this kind of preaching. We come from ISKCON long ago, where people used to be taught or preached to give up everything just give up everything. Then you committed devotee, and then the bhakti will develop. And as I said, it makes sense logically, but so many people were hurt by that. And we give a recent example from our previous association. It was a lady, 70 years old, who, from her son, I heard, she's always crying over the fact that she didn't become an opera singer. And she's dedicated Vaishnavi. Everything's fine. But her personal life, emotional life is a trauma. And not to say that, oh, she's not a good devotee or bhakti didn't work on her, but I think it's that we have to live our natural life within our circumstances and have the objective of bhakti that will lead us to bhava, kept as a very special, cherished spiritual part of our life, our psychic, our drive. And what I want to say is that you know, there's no disqualification. So what I want to emphasize is that you have to, because you said very clearly, to perform bhakti in order to become famous, in order to fulfill one's own desire, in order to satisfy one or missing things in life or whatever, compensate through bhakti, that's the wrong thing. But to have a purpose that's separate from bhakti, that also drive one to some destination in this life, knowing the bhakti is eternal, and my bhakti leads me to bhava, but besides I have another track going on that way. So I wanted to share that thought, and from what you just said, it became clear to me finally that it's the way to understand it. If I'm wrong, please correct me.
I mean, I'm with you. I followed what you said. You said many things, so I can't necessarily reply to everything. But in general, the idea that our nature, what you call the swabhav, the vasanas that we're born with, that these things can all just be chucked out and we can just jump into some social mold and everything will just be quick, fixed and solid if we're disciplined thereafter. This is, really not a very realistic attitude, and nor is it the way that the Varnashram society or the path of bhakti was designed. So that people can work from wherever they're in as per their circumstances, and that bhakti is practicable in many, many different ways, specific to the unique circumstances of every individual and their personal life, their personal psychological disposition, their personal social circumstances. This line of thought is how the system is built, so to speak, or it's meant to be a highly flexible process that's suitable to all the diversity of circumstances that can come up for people in the world. But when you propagate certain specific kind of paradigms or examples of like, this is a great bhakta, and then you sort of socially praise that or lionize that so that everyone's trying to be that, or I can't be that, but I can be like close to that, or I can be the one who's the biggest assistant of that or something, then it takes people into this adoration of a superficial form, and it can stray them from a further sense of pursuit of self-awareness, subtler grasp of what the whole path of bhakti, the process of bhakti, what purification of the psyche is in practice, and how they can meaningfully follow this path for themselves in their life, rather than just trying to, run with a herd and think that being part of that will, solve all their matters for them.
So
that's what
what
comes
you're
to my
saying is
mind.
that idealizing bhakti by taking some perfect example, Rupa Gosvami renounced this and kept, this much money, little bit money to survive, and they've rescued everything. And some other acharya did this, and bhakta is doing this, bhakta is doing that, is very detached. And following that kind of ideal from the very beginning, hoping that this will produce bhakti, is a mistake. Is what I'm saying. If somebody's not on that level, of course, like the ideal.
Right. Ultimately, things like renunciation, etc., they have to emerge out of mature self-awareness rather than, be like some, game at skill and discipline.
Okay.
So
one has to be very self-reflective and sincere. It's not a competition game.
And get the education needed to meaningfully be introspective. Anybody can be introspective, but if they don't have the actual light of the knowledge taught by our acharyas with which to introspect, then their introspection may not be that valuable.
Oh, I see. I didn't see it before. Interesting. Right. You have to have framework or knowledge actually to feed your self dialogue with.
Exactly.
Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Sure. And I think there's another hand.
Yes, it's me. My question is similar to Vidyasundarji question, but a little bit different at the same time. What would be advice for someone who, for example, has an aspiration or a desire to have or to achieve desireless bhakti for Sri Bhagavan's lotus feet, but his or her life circumstances, or let's say previous karma, for some reason does not allow to, for example, just chant Lord's name all day and read Shastra, and this person, for example, by karma is forced to do some other things, like to do work. For example, he or she doesn't have a lot of money and she has to earn money for living, and that's why it takes time, even though this person, for example, doesn't want to do these things, but the karma is such that she is forced, for example, to do some work. She does not have any desire to do it because, for example, and this person has only desire like to do devotional things, but cannot because of the previous karma. What would be the advice? Like, is it possible, like, somehow to offer these things to Bhagavan so that, like, what to do in this situation?
We have a verse coming up. It's either the next one or the one after that that's exactly on this topic. So I won't say so much about that at the moment because we'll come to some discussion of that soon. But essentially the principle is, what do we really identify ourselves as and with? This is the core of what sticks from our actions. In the Gita, we hear this extreme remark that if someone is completely free from ahankar, even if they destroy the entire world, they're not held accountable for any of that karma. I mean, it's more or less the strongest way you could possibly make this point, that what really attaches us to the world is our identification with a particular role within it and the fulfillment of particular desires, the experience of particular pleasures within the world. So if one, forced by circumstances for just fundamental survival, health, basic needs, has to involve in things in the world, that won't be detrimental in any way to one's movement on the path of bhakti, provided that one go about those activities with the particular attunement of one's attitude. In other words, that one doesn't identify oneself as that, one doesn't see that as the principal source of meaning or depth or significance in one's life, but one fulfills one's responsibility without excessive attachment or excessive aversion, just takes it on as it comes, as is required, But with all the whatever degree of time, energy, opportunity one has, independent of that is dedicated to things of the bhakti domain, then that's essentially all that anyone can do. And according to our circumstances, some may have more opportunity, less opportunity, but what's most significant is simply that we utilize whatever opportunity we're given. And the extent to which we utilize it is the extent to which we're benefited. And if along with that we're detached from the other things, we shouldn't be too much worried about it or too much sort of harping on ourselves that we're doing worldly stuff and this is mundane and that kind of thing. I mean, no doubt I'm sure it can be dry. There's no doubt that the jada or the dull is the word for matter in Sanskrit, Bangla, one of them is jada. And another sense of the word jada is also dull. It can also be an insult for someone who's stupid or dull. So if we play on words a little, we can say, the dull is certainly dull. So to feel that the dull is not dull, or it doesn't make you dull to feel that this is very dull. But as such, with composure and with faith and with a sense that, as the verse tate nukampam susamikshramanu says, always looking to the grace of the Lord, always seeing Him within things, honoring His presence within all persons, all circumstances, seeing and being grateful for even the chance to chant the name of Krishna once a day. Suppose you're so suffocated in some terrible worldly circumstance that you can't even chant the name of Krishna more than once in 24 hours. You might say, God, that must be terrible. But you could look at that same circumstance and say, I at least got to chant one name of my Prabhu. You could also see it that way. So, sometimes there may be a tendency to see the absence, but on the other hand, to also cultivate gratitude for the presence or for whatever opportunity that one has, and to cherish that, utilize that with the fullness of one's heart. That will be quite endearing and quite enriching. And it's not that Bhagavan isn't aware of people's circumstances, and if he's fully, cognizant of the challenges that someone is in, and if he sees that person, utilizing whatever chance they have in a hearty and sincere way, that's undoubtedly greatly endearing. So anyhow, we'll come to a little bit more of some of the detail on that topic soon. So I'll leave it at that.
Just since you mentioned it, it's quite it just developed nicely. I was wondering that. Oh well, actually, I would assess that this what is just explained is a part of Sharanagati, that once humbly accepts one's own position, and from there one surrender. Seeing that my Lord is my everything, and whatever I need to do, it's just for Him. But primarily one should accept one's own circumstances, which is from where he can grow, or she can grow the bhakti. Is that right?
Absolutely. And through all the beautiful knowledge that we gain in the Bhagavat or from our acharyas, then
yes,
we don't have to see things in a mundane way. We might be in, quote, mundane circumstances, but we don't have to see them as merely that. If we have to, meet a person who's not ostensibly a devotee, it doesn't mean we can't treat them with respect, remember the presence of Bhagavan within them, take it as an opportunity to express our regard and our adoration for our dear beloved Bhagavan sitting in the heart of that person by offering some appropriate behavior, some kind behavior towards them. It's not that we have to exclude those things from also being integrated ways of expressing and cultivating bhakti. So while we like hearing and chanting and remembering and, the grand practices of bhakti that are direct bhakti as such. It doesn't mean that when circumstances don't allow us to engage in those activities that we have to not integrate the spirit of bhakti and more subtle practices of bhakti into those conventional actions as well. We can, in other words.
Thank you.
All right. Is that it?
From my side, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Great. Then I think we'll just leave it at that for tonight, and in our next go, we'll get to the next verse, and little by little, we'll make our way through the Padyavali. So, my pranams, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namo, Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe.